There we go.
And Robert, why do you take it away with the walkthrough? And I will just drop off at some point,
Cool.
which I think because you're the host, that should mean that the call doesn't end.
I have no idea where these are going to go though, because I'm not signed into Zoom.
You
It's
must be
interesting. Uh,
if you're using Zoom, you must be signed into it. You signed in through SSO.
no, it doesn't. It's not forced me to sign in,
Well,
You don't have
apparently.
to be.
let's see what happens afterwards.
Yeah,
It'll work out. Yep.
yeah, yeah.
It's
We'll figure
recording,
it
so
out.
it's going somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, to somewhere. Cool. All right. So let me share my screen. I had a performance issue to investigate, and this was somewhat interesting. Basically, when you turn on, uh, where do I need to go to this? Go there. Um, when you turn on this feature flag, it makes the new project thing uh, basically completely fall over. So I'm just, where is the new project button? Oh, there. Right. So I've enabled it for myself on production, and it goes for, as you can see, it is loading very fast. It basically makes the new project page go from about 500 millisecond page load to like 15 seconds. And it might actually just fail. I've had this just fail to load multiple times. Oh, there we go. So yeah, we're up to 10 this time. It is a little bit worrying that it seems to have 4,002 queries, apparently. But we'll come to that. The major one, though, is this nice big query right at the start. And this is the difference from the feature flag being enabled. This query is suddenly super slow. And it's coming from group project templates count. And it's basically um, the bit that generates uh, this number here. It's very time consuming to generate a number. Um, it also means that when you try and actually load this, it then does the same query again. Uh, the and yeah, you can see it's just super slow. The I'll go into what exactly is going on, but the background to it is that there was a chain of merge requests for this. There was a request from a few years back that means that inherited members of groups can't see group templates if they haven't got direct permissions on the group, basically. It's sort of explained here, and there was a fix done to change that. That change was quite small. All it really does is it's filtering the projects that can be seen based on permissions. So that's a bit of an N+1 issue, but that's not actually the problem. The real problem is here, and this is not very obvious in the slightest, but basically it's changed a little bit since this time as well. But the min access level parameter going to this group, to the groups finder, changes the query that gets returned entirely. And this is where it took me a week to realize that this is actually what's happening. And I also needed Vasily to explain what the difference here was as well with this found groups thing. So what and this issue is enormous as well. But basically the query that with the feature flag turned off, this is the query, which is nice and normal sort of size query. As you see, it's not got any unions in it, and that comes in. So it's a fairly standard query. It has got some nested selects in it, which tend to happen quite a lot with Rails scopes being used and used as calls into other ones. It does tend to nest queries, which is quite clever. When you turn on the feature flag, this is the query instead. And it starts to have a lot of a lot of nested stuff and a lot of union queries as well. And it keeps going. It keeps going. So that's the query, and that's the 10-second query. And as you can see, it took me a really long time to figure out actually what's going on here. But what happens in the code, I'm going to do it into Vim instead because this is probably the easiest way of saying it. So in the user model, I'll go back to, oh, I can't go back, that's annoying. Oh God, where was I? All right. So when the feature flag's disabled, we still have the same query as existed before. So I've changed nothing. So it's got a parameter of min access level. That's passed to the groups finder. And then there's a where condition that we limit it, the results that come from this query, to those that have templates. So this is fetched from a separate finder. So the separate finder, there's two queries happening. There's one where it figures out what groups have templates, and then it limits the results of the groups finder to that. And it has this min access level thing. So that prohibits finding all of the groups because not everybody has direct permissions on a group. So this is why the change was made to find all groups that a user has access to and then limit it afterwards, because otherwise it just fetches the groups they have direct permissions on. So the change removes that min access level bit. Where the problem is, and as you can see, I've removed that where condition. And this is where it gets really, really nasty. So in the groups finder, I've rewritten this. This has just been refactored because it's basically incomprehensible as it was before. It was all backwards. So like every method was at the other end of the file from where it's called. So I've basically reorganized it. But what happens is when it's executed, it can ignore the find union thing. I'll come to that in a minute. But so we've now got a method called filtered groups. So this loops through all of the groups that are available, and then it adds some filters to them. And what it's essentially doing is, under certain conditions, it returns early. And under one of those conditions is when min access level is passed. So when min access level is passed, it returns only groups with the min access level, and it doesn't perform the rest of the code, which includes fetching groups that the user isn't directly related to. So I've rewritten this to be more obvious. You've got ones that they're a member of, you've got ones that they're authorized to, and then you've got public groups. And public groups is where it gets really fun, because public groups by default returns every public group on GitLab in this query, and then it filters them. And so when we had this where condition, that where condition is on the final result of the union queries, not on each sub query in the union. So it would fetch 4 million public groups on gitlab.com, and then the where condition afterwards would filter them out. It wasn't actually preventing loading 4 million public groups, as like it wasn't restricting it. It's just fetching all of the public groups and then iterating it afterwards. So the only real change in this merge request is that I've used a built-in part of the groups finder, which is filter group IDs, instead of a where condition. And then in the groups finder, that happens here where it's got filter groups. So what this all groups thing does is it returns an array of scopes. The array of scopes, oh sorry, is there a chat message? Okay. See you, so the array of scopes is then turned into a union query. And so that's where this find union thing is. It makes a union query of multiple scopes, so it's performing only one query. But because it's doing that, those conditions need to be added to, in order to make a more efficient query, they need to be added to each member of that union query, not the overall query that is returned as part of find union. So like in the old version with the where query, that where query is added after find union here. So it's tacked on the end of this, which means that the union query is then restricted by the where condition. So it's already fetched all of that data and then it's limiting it afterwards. But by setting it as the as another parameter, which is handled by filter groups, has a bunch of different things it can filter the groups on. And filter groups is applied to each member of the union query. And it's applied here, as you can see on the filtered groups thing. So after this array of scopes is returned, they are then each modified by adding the filters to each of those scopes. And then that's restricting each member of this large union query. And so by changing from a where condition to using filter group IDs, one of these filters is to add an ID in of that other query, but it's going to add it to each member of the union query rather than as a whole. So in theory, it shouldn't anymore return 4 million rows and then filter them. It should filter in that public groups query to a smaller subset of data and therefore not churn through as much data, which is where the big problem is. I can actually show if you want to see the explain of this, it's very exciting. Because this is where it's obvious where the problem is, I suppose. Where did I link it? Right. So this is the explain. And if it's red, it's bad if you've not looked at these before. Fairly obvious, I suppose. But the really, really nasty one is right down here. This one. So it's doing an index scan. And it's returning, in this instance, a mere 2 million rows. But it's hit more than that. Oh yeah, rows removed by filter 4,680,000. It used 18 gig of RAM to do this. It's quite fast to be, well, no, it's not that fast. What's 700,000 milliseconds? 7 seconds, I think. Is that right? 700 ms in s. Let's see. 700 seconds. Yeah, that's, I have no idea if that's correct or not. But anyway, it's bad. The red is bad. And
10
so
minutes?
10 minutes wouldn't surprise me. It's there's there's clearly some odd measurements in here, but yeah, basically it returns far more data. This is when you're looking at these explains, if you're not used to these, this is what you're looking for, is where it's removing too much data, like it's found too much data that it's then removing in a loop. So this is good in that it's doing an index scan. Nice. That means that it's not looping through every row in the table. It's picked these up from an index. So it's just found all of the groups based on like parent ID. Great. But the filter here is actually on the visibility level, which has been applied afterwards. So this is an unindexed part. So it's then filtering the indexed results by visibility level. I did actually make a change where I added an index that included visibility level, which is this one. So I added one, and then it's an index condition, if you can see the difference there. So this is a filter, and that means that it's filtering every result. This means that it's on an index condition, which means that it's significantly faster, and you can see using a mere 3 gig of RAM at that point. So I haven't actually included a merge request for this yet because in theory, it shouldn't be filtering as much data anymore anyway because of that change where it's removing the where condition. So that's what I'm going to try first. If it's still slow, I will add this index, which just adds visibility level to that index. But where possible, we try not to add too many new indexes because they take up storage space on the machine, basically. And it can also cause some query oddities sometimes. But you can still see it's hitting an awful lot of rows here because it's still returning too much data for the query, but it is at least in that instance a little bit faster. So yeah, that's basically the problem. Yeah, just 12 minutes. uh, so does anyone have any questions? Because that's kind of it, but I realize I've just basically stream of consciousness through that.
Robert, when you're testing this sort of stuff, and I see there you made the change where you added you were testing adding the index.
Mm.
Do you push that and then test again, or like do you have a space where we have a lot of data that we can test?
So for
Sorry, I
the
just never done that. Sorry.
no, so it's a really good question. So I do find with a lot of performance stuff, I just have to test it in production. But we do have a nicer way of doing database stuff, which is yeah, this. Um, so it's called Postgres.ai. We all have access to this, and it has basically a replica of the production database on it. You can't fetch data from it, but what you can do is you can perform explains and
Run
plans.
explains.
And most useful one is you can do it exec, so you can add indexes here, which is what I did for that test. So basically, I ran an explain, generated this explain, and then I wrote a query that adds, not query, I wrote a thingy to add that index. It took about 3 minutes to make the index, I think. So that's actually something they look for in the merge request when you're adding indexes. They kind of want to know how long it's going to take to process. Um, and
How
so
often does that get to go back to how often does that get refreshed, removed, or
I actually
changed?
don't know. I think it maybe once a day might be something, or maybe it gets updated faster than that. It's been a while since I've checked exactly how it's set up, but typically I find this quite up to date. And the nice thing as well is you can just reset it. So each one is its own individual session. So you're not affecting someone else's changes. It's like working with the database at that point in time. And you can reset it and revert your changes back out. Um, it can be a little bit glitchy sometimes. Like for some reason, it wasn't generating these Depes explains properly this time, but largely that's quite a good tool for any database changes. And we used to have like a channel you could do it in, but that was just an absolute mess. It's like 10 people at once all putting explains in it, just sort of scrolling past like this. So now you have to use the interface for it. But yeah, if you've not used it before, it's a really good tool for doing that sort of stuff. Like I'll do an example quickly. Actually, if we do, let's just take the original query and do an explain of it. Yeah, so you do sort of explain and then just paste that big lump in, and it'll start start running a new session. It can be a little bit delayed sometimes. Um, it sometimes picks up on old sessions you've got going to. Like I think they last for a few days, and then it shuts them down automatically.
Yeah, I think it's 24 hours.
Yeah, I've had one before where I got really cheesed off because an index took something like 12 hours to generate, and I logged back on to see what had happened, and then it had deleted it because the time had passed because I'd been asleep until then. So yeah, it will then generate this sort of stuff. It'll keep processing, so it'll do it first without execution. So it'll just like estimate basically what it thinks is going to happen, and it thinks how the database will process it. But you actually want usually the real one, the good stuff, because it'll tell you how long things will take. I don't know why this query is taking 29 seconds. That's not accurate. But the useful part is usually in if you sort of click into this, it'll sort of show you with execution and without execution. But these are quite hard to read. I find I know what I'm looking at in these, and I find these really difficult to scan. So that's where this Depes thing is really good. I generated it, so it does it automatically, and you can actually look through it, and it's color coded, which I like. It's nice. So yeah, I find that really useful for these sorts of things. Any other questions?
Just one thing to mention that these query plans are usually requested by database reviewers when queries are changed or introduced. So if someone says the words like, could you please give me a query plan? This is what should be done.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert, for showing it.
It's a really useful tool, and I will say, like, database changes at GitLab, I try and avoid as much as possible, because the effort involved in actually getting the merge request done now is quite high. And it's for a good reason, because we've had a lot of stuff in the past. It's like, oh, let's just put this new query up, and then it breaks the index or something, or it shifts where the query is being directed to, and all sorts of interesting things. So I understand why we do it, but it is quite time consuming, especially if you're adding something quite significant. Like maybe you're adding a new index, but it indexes projects or users. Well, the timings for that index creation can actually lock the database if they're done in the wrong way. You have to do them in certain ways. So this tool is probably the most useful for all database work, I find. Anything else? Yeah. Cool. Right, I'll stop sharing. Yeah, it's a fun one to investigate anyway. Just I figured it out, so therefore it was fun. It's not fun when I get stuck and I can't figure it out. I don't like those. But yeah, that's the first sort of weird query thing in a while for me, like where I've looked at something and got, this makes no sense. Why is the query changing that dramatically? It's clearer now that I've refactored that groups finder. If you look at the current groups finder in master and try and figure out exactly what it's doing, you're looking at a method and then it's defined at the bottom, and then the next method is defined somewhere randomly in the middle, and then there's like 3 methods that are never used in there, and methods for just a single variable return and stuff like this. So yeah, I've rewritten it, but the actual change is a 1-line change. So we'll see. All right, I'll stop that recording. I don't know where these are going though.